It began with a meal, a warm plate, steam rising, the clink of silverware, the hum of soft music in a cozy dining room, laughter, low and content. A toast to new beginnings 2 months into a marriage that looked picture-perfect on every surface. Candles flickered. A glass of red wine tilted, caught the light, and a single bite was taken. The guests said the food was exceptional, rich, intense, like it had been simmering for hours and something more than just spice. They complimented her talent, raised their glasses again, and when the evening ended, they left full, satisfied, impressed. No one asked where he was. The next morning, the sun rose like it always did. But in that house, one chair stayed empty. A phone rang and rang, but no one picked up. Days passed. Silence grew heavier. And then, someone called the police. What they found would make even the most seasoned detective step back in disbelief. The kitchen told a story no recipe could explain. The freezer held answers no one wanted. And in the middle of it all stood a woman with a calm expression, in a history no one had bothered to read. This isn't just another case. This is a question of trust, of love, of hunger in its most horrifying form. She said she loved him. She said she'd never let him go. She meant it. Stay with us. Because the truth isn't just chilling, it's unforgettable. Eugene, Oregon, October 2023. The kind of place where people still wave to each other across lawns. Where porch lights glow warm in the early evening. Where neighbors bring over casseroles for new homeowners and ask how the move-in went. It's quiet. Predictable. The kind of quiet that makes the smallest disturbance feel like an alarm bell. That's why Elena Rivera stood out. She moved into the neighborhood in late summer. A modest 2-story house at the end of a tree-lined cul-de-sac. Red door. Hanging flower pots. A rosemary bush by the front steps. She introduced herself with a shy smile and a tray of lemon bars. Told the neighbors she was a chef, just moved from Santa Fe. Said she wanted a fresh start. Her voice was soft, her eyes a little tired, like someone who had seen enough of life to stop expecting too much from it. But there was warmth there. A politeness that disarmed everyone. Within a month, she had married Marcus Hale. He was local. Well-liked. A civil engineer who just finalized a divorce. He mowed his own lawn, waved from his pickup truck, always offered to help with heavy lifting. He'd been quiet for a while after the split. But after meeting Elena, he seemed to light up again. He was smiling more. Hosting dinners. Talking about future plans. About starting over. They were newlyweds. The couple everyone wanted to root for. On the surface, their life looked idyllic. Photos of picnics by the river, a surprise anniversary dinner she cooked just 5 weeks into their marriage, blurry selfies in front of the stove, flour on their faces. Elena had started a TikTok account, sharing quick clips of their life together, her plating elaborate meals, him sneaking bites while she laughed and swatted his hand away. In every frame, she looked at him like he was the only person in the world. But on the night of October 14th, something changed. She invited a few neighbors over for what she called a taste-testing dinner. She told them she was working on a new menu and wanted feedback. Said Marcus wouldn't be joining. He'd had a long day, wasn't feeling well, just needed to rest upstairs. No one thought much of it. There were 5 guests. They sat around the table, wine in hand, commenting on the richness of the dishes. Elena served them course after course. Braised ribs. A thick stew with unfamiliar spices. A dense, gamey pâté. The portions were small, but deeply flavorful. A few joked that they'd never had meat like that before. She smiled and said it was an old family recipe. By the time dessert came out, one of the guests realized something odd. There were no lights on upstairs. No creaking floorboards. No footsteps. No sign that Marcus was home at all. But no one asked. The dinner ended just before midnight. Elena thanked them warmly, handed one of the guests a container of leftovers to take home, and closed the door behind them. The house went dark. The street fell silent again. 2 days later, Marcus's boss called in a missing persons report. He hadn't shown up for work. His phone went straight to voicemail. No one had heard from him. No one, except Elena, who told the responding officer that he'd left after an argument and hadn't come back. She said she thought he needed space, that maybe he'd gone back to his ex-wife for closure, that she didn't want to bother anyone with her worry. But something didn't sit right. Neighbors noticed she hadn't left the house in days. The windows stayed shut. Trash cans were full but never brought to the curb. And then came the smell. Faint at first, like old meat. Then sharper, sour, metallic. Someone called the police again, this time with urgency. And when officers returned to the house on October 18th, Elena opened the door, smiling gently. She said she'd just been tired, that she hadn't eaten in days, that she was about to start dinner. The officers asked to come in. She stepped aside. The last time anyone saw her smile was in that doorway. What they would find inside would break the quiet of Eugene forever. The officers entered the house just before sunset. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. The air was still. A faint trace of incense hung in the living room, mixing strangely with the sharper scent they'd been warned about. The furniture was tidy. The couch cushions fluffed. A candle flickered on the mantelpiece beside a photo of Marcus and Elena, arms around each other, smiling. But as they moved toward the kitchen, that smell grew heavier. They asked if Marcus was home. Elena hesitated, said she didn't know, claimed she hadn't seen him in days. Her voice was calm, but her hands trembled when she reached for a glass of water. The officers noticed she hadn't made eye contact once since they stepped inside. They asked to look around. She nodded. Upstairs, the bed was made. Marcus's phone sat on the nightstand, its battery dead. His clothes were still hanging in the closet. A packed duffel bag rested at the foot of the bed, untouched. Downstairs, the kitchen told a different story. The countertops were spotless. Too spotless. Bleach still lingered in the air. The garbage bin was empty, but a closer look at the sink revealed dark stains under the drain, stains that didn't quite come out with scrubbing. One of the officers opened the freezer. Inside, vacuum-sealed bags, neatly stacked. No labels. Just cuts of meat, frozen solid. Some were large. Some oddly shaped. One had a hint of what looked like a tattoo beneath the ice. They asked Elena what it was. She didn't answer. Instead, she reached for a chair and sat down. Her expression didn't change. She just looked up and said, "You're going to need a warrant." They left the house within minutes. The next day, police returned with that warrant. Crime scene units, forensic experts, detectives. The freezer bags were seized and rushed to a lab. The walls were swabbed. Floorboards lifted. The drains were examined. In the backyard, cadaver dogs caught scent near the compost pile and a small burn pit just beyond the hedges. One of the dinner guests came forward voluntarily. Said she couldn't stop thinking about that night. About how the meal had been. How Elena had stared at her plate the whole time, waiting for reactions. The guest had been too polite to say anything then. But the food had tasted wrong. Too rich. Metallic. The texture, slightly off. Like nothing she'd ever eaten before. She still had leftovers in her fridge. She turned them over to police. Lab results confirmed it. Human DNA. Tissue from a male. Partial match to the Hale family. Back at the crime lab, the freezer contents were examined. What they found matched Marcus's dental records. His fingerprints. Fragments of skin still attached to one of the vacuum seals were identified through tattoo registries. It was him. The timeline came into focus. Marcus had not simply left. He had been killed, dismembered, and stored. Carefully, meticulously, with knowledge of anatomy that wasn't common. The cuts were clean, almost clinical. Elena hadn't panicked. She hadn't rushed. She'd taken her time. Detectives started digging into her past. Elena Rivera had legally changed her name in 2019. Her birth name, Lena Alvarado. In 2014, she had been enrolled in a culinary institute in Albuquerque until she was expelled for an incident involving the dissection of a pig carcass during a kitchen exam. Staff reported she had gone too far. When questioned, she claimed she was just curious. Years later, she had worked briefly in a mortuary kitchen, preparing meals for grieving families. Her supervisor there described her as polite, clean, and a little too comfortable around death. Then came the sealed court record. In 2016, a restraining order filed by a former boyfriend. The petition claimed Elena had threatened to preserve a piece of him if he ever left her. He never pressed charges. He moved states, disappeared from the public eye. Back in Eugene, neighbors were stunned. Interviews painted a haunting picture of a woman who had watched everything, who listened more than she spoke, who always cooked from scratch, who never once let anyone else bring a dish to her home. One man remembered her giving him a jar of homemade stew. He'd eaten it, said it was the most flavorful thing he'd ever tasted. Now, he couldn't stop replaying the memory. Had he eaten Marcus? In a quiet interrogation room, Elena said little. But when detectives asked her why she had done it, she finally looked up. And she smiled. Then she asked, "Didn't you like the food?" The room fell silent. There was no shouting, no remorse, just a cold calm. The kind that settles only when someone knows they've done exactly what they intended to do. What came next would stun the courtroom. But the story, the real story, was already written, sealed in vacuum-packed plastic, waiting in the dark of a suburban freezer. And the questions were only beginning. The trial hadn't even begun, but already the case was making national headlines. Cannibal Bride of Oregon. Dinner party of death. She cooked her husband and served him. The press circled the quiet neighborhood like vultures. Satellite vans lined the street. Reporters stood outside Elena's home, whispering into microphones while neighbors closed their curtains. TikTok exploded with conspiracy theories. Reddit threads dissected every post from her now-deleted profile. Her cooking videos, once charming, harmless, were rewatched with new horror. That stew? That pâté? People were timing the upload dates, matching it to Marcus's last known appearance. The puzzle had begun to form its final image. But investigators were still missing one thing: the moment of death. There was no blood trail, no clear weapon, no sign of struggle, no screams reported, no calls made. The turning point came when forensic teams finally extracted data from Marcus's cloud storage. His phone had automatically synced a video days before he went missing. It was only 15 seconds long, a blurry clip, shot vertically. Just kitchen tiles and a muffled voice in the background. The phone had slipped, maybe hit the floor while recording accidentally. But audio engineers enhanced the sound. And when the background noise cleared, the words were unmistakable. "You promised me. You said you wouldn't leave. You said you were mine." Then came the sound of metal. A thud. Something dragged. It wasn't a scream. It was a gasp. Almost as if the breath had been taken from someone. Sudden. Final. The timestamp was October 13th, one day before the dinner. That short clip, nearly discarded as an accident, became the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. A search of Elena's laptop brought even more. A folder titled simply, "Preservation." Inside, recipes. Dozens. Each file named with a single letter. One, labeled M, had notes on brining methods, meat softening enzymes, and thermal temperatures for bone marrow extraction. Photos of dry-aged flesh. Organ diagrams. A calendar with prep times marked down to the hour. Another file contained Marcus's medical records, downloaded from a patient portal months before they even married. Elena had been planning this long before the wedding. She didn't lose control. She wasn't pushed to the edge. She waited, patiently, quietly, lovingly, until the night came when everything she needed, trust, proximity, intimacy, was finally in place. But there was still more. A neighbor came forward with Ring camera footage from the night of October 14th. Around 2 a.m., a faint figure could be seen in Elena's backyard. She was moving slowly, dragging what looked like a rolled rug toward the garden shed. 2 hours later, smoke rose from behind the fence. She stayed out there until dawn. Police recovered burnt bone fragments from that pit, too damaged for DNA. But among them, they found a molar, cracked, blackened, matching the dental work in Marcus's records. A crown, titanium root, something that wouldn't burn easily. He hadn't just been cut apart. He'd been cooked in stages, stored, portions burned, others prepared. The case had gone from homicide to something far more chilling, premeditated consumption. Psychologists were brought in. They studied Elena's journals, her old emails, her school records. What they found wasn't madness. It was control. Measured. Methodical. She had been obsessed with taste, with process, with preservation. From her days in culinary school to her job at the funeral kitchen, she had treated the human body the way a chef might view any other protein. Cut, sear, brine, rest. And Marcus? He had been the final ingredient. When prosecutors revealed the full extent of her preservation files to the jury, the courtroom fell into silence. Photos, descriptions, temperatures, plating styles. She had even set a dinner table the night he died. For one, the plate was empty. The wine was poured. And the caption she saved under that final image? Finally, a meal worth remembering. No one spoke after that slide. The gallery stared, unmoving. Jurors wiped tears. One had to excuse herself from the room. And at the defense table, Elena sat still, hands folded. No visible emotion. It wasn't a question of guilt anymore. It was a question of why. And the answer, still locked inside her, was about to be forced into the light. The trial lasted 21 days. 3 weeks of testimonies, forensic evidence, expert witnesses, and a courtroom packed with people who had once been Elena's neighbors, dinner guests, co-workers, even classmates from her old culinary program. Most of them weren't there for justice. They were there to understand. They wanted to hear something, anything that might explain how the soft-spoken woman who once handed out lemon bars became the architect of something this grotesque. The prosecution's closing argument was simple: premeditation, deception, and cold-blooded calculation. They painted a timeline with chilling precision. From the moment Elena met Marcus at a local farmer's market in late July, to the night she fed parts of his body to their friends, her actions were not impulsive. They were ritualistic, practiced. They called it the most deliberate murder Oregon had seen in decades. The defense tried a different approach. They leaned into mental health, childhood trauma, claimed a dissociative episode, hinted at emotional abuse, though no proof of that existed. They said Elena had suffered a break from reality, that she wasn't aware of what she'd done. But their case unraveled when the prosecution displayed time-stamped photographs of the vacuum-sealed meat bags, each labeled with Marcus's initials. The planning was too detailed, too thoughtful. The jury returned the verdict in under 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. First-degree murder, abuse of a corpse, tampering with evidence. 5 counts of reckless endangerment for serving human remains to unsuspecting guests. And 1 charge rarely seen in modern courtrooms: criminal desecration of a body with intent to distribute. The judge spoke slowly during sentencing. He called the crime a betrayal so complete, so monstrous, it strips the word marriage of meaning. Elena was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She showed no reaction, no visible regret. She simply nodded, as if she already knew how this story would end. In the weeks that followed, the town of Eugene changed. The red door at the end of the cul-de-sac was painted over. The house was condemned and eventually sold to a developer who swore he'd never live in it. Neighbors stopped hosting dinners. The next block party was canceled. The rosemary bush at the front steps withered, unwatered. Some of the dinner guests struggled deeply. One began treatment for PTSD. Another left the state entirely. The woman who had taken home the leftovers checked herself into an inpatient facility after experiencing recurring night terrors. She told a therapist she couldn't eat red meat anymore, couldn't trust her own kitchen, couldn't stop smelling iron when she closed her eyes. Marcus's family held a memorial service without a body. They buried a sealed urn containing the recovered tooth and fragments. His mother spoke through tears, saying she would never forgive herself for not calling him that week. His sister, a nurse, said she would dedicate her life to victims of domestic violence. Even though there was no history of physical abuse, she believed now that emotional isolation could be just as lethal. Elena never gave another statement. No interviews, no press, no apology. She refused all visitors, including the one journalist who had covered the case from the beginning and sent her 14 handwritten letters requesting just one answer. Why? That journalist published a book a year later. In it, she described Elena as an empty kitchen, clean, quiet, and cold. No sounds, no warmth, just the lingering smell of something you can't name, long after the fire has gone out. To this day, there is no evidence Elena had killed anyone before Marcus. But investigators quietly reopened the 2016 missing persons case of her former boyfriend, the one who filed the restraining order. His body was never found. He had no next of kin, no trail, just one odd detail in his file. A handwritten note in the original report from a detective who has since retired. It read, "Girlfriend said he always tasted like cinnamon." Strange comment. Dismissed at the time. The case remains open. And as the years pass, one question continues to haunt those who watch this story unfold. What does it mean to love someone so much you want to keep a part of them forever? And how far would someone go to make sure no one else ever got a taste? If this case left you breathless, if you're still sitting there trying to process the weight of it all, don't keep it to yourself. These are more than just stories. They're warnings. They're windows into the minds of people we think we know, until it's too late. What would you have done if you were one of the dinner guests that night? Would you have noticed something was off? Would you have spoken up? Would you have been able to sleep afterward, knowing Had you, if you found yourself leaning in, wanting to know more, to understand the unthinkable, then make sure you don't miss what's coming next. Every week, we uncover a case that challenges everything we think we know about love, loyalty, and the darkest corners of the human mind. Subscribe now. Hit that notification bell. Share this video with someone who thinks they'd never fall for someone like Elena. Because trust can be the most dangerous ingredient of all. And remember, what happens behind closed doors always leaves a trace.